Hello, my name is Paul Rogney, and I'm the host of the Drumming News Network. In recent years, handcrafted cymbals seem to be a growing market. Rob Cook of Rebeats, author and creator of the Chicago Drum Show, believes that handcrafted cymbals are the next frontier, much like the interest in custom drum manufacturing that took place in the early 1990s. May 20th and 21st of this year at the Chicago Drum Show, you will be able to meet and experience presentations on cymbal making from each of these cymbal craftsmen, and on the 21st, a panel of all the craftsmen together. The series of interviews that I am doing are literally a discovery as it happens. I purposely did not do I hardly did any research on each of these cymbal smiths ahead of time. I've custom built drums and my own drum hardware, but the idea of cymbal crafting is something that seems part voodoo, craftsmanship, and passion. Three things that I have no interest in when it comes to actually creating a cymbal. In each of these interviews, we get to see each of their own personalities, and like a true artist, even with similar approaches, their outcomes are completely different. On this episode, I speak with Timothy Roberts of Reverie Drum Co and Timothy Roberts Handcrafted Cymbals. His cymbals are made with the highest quality B20 bronze, hand-hammered, and lathed into incredibly expressive and nuanced cymbals for all styles. Whether you have an old cymbal you'd like to rework, or you'd like a custom creation, Timothy is dedicated to bringing out the best a cymbal has to offer. In addition to manufacturing drum, cymbals, and percussion instruments, he's a new father. This will prove to be a very interesting episode. So let's get on with it. Well, Timothy, welcome to the show. I just wanted to have you on specifically to talk in support of the Chicago Drum Show panel of cymbal craftsmanship. Can you tell me about that a little bit? What's that panel going to be all about?
Well, so Rob Cook put it together, and I think I talked to him at the Nashville show last year about it. It is going to be a bunch of my buddies, a bunch of guys that I really respect, guys that when I got into this craft, I studied, guys that I really look up to. So it's going to be an honor to be on a panel with them, and we'll discuss cymbals. Hopefully we'll talk about the movement that seems to be happening right now in the indie cymbalsmith world, and how there seems to be kind of a groundswell of this new thing that people are discovering, like that there's these independent makers that make cymbals, handcraft cymbals, get blanks from Turkey, and do the whole thing that Spiz did. So it should be fun.
That's really cool. Yeah, it sounds very exciting. So before we get into that, I want to learn more about you specifically. And like I said, we're just doing a rapid fire. We're going to do it fast, so we can actually pull off a half hour, everybody. So this is why it's going real fast. Okay.
I'm ready.
Specifically, what got you, how did you start drumming? Like, did you start drumming on a drum kit for school? What got you interested in drums?
It was church. So my dad was a music minister, and he was a band director. And ever since I was probably 3 or 4, he noticed that I like to put pots and pans together. It's kind of the story of every drummer. It's like put pots and pans together, bang on and make drum sets. There was one story where I took a pair of drumsticks when my parents weren't looking, and I went to the family piano, and I just went to town for like 5 minutes, and we had this piano that had all the keys were chipped at the edges. So it had all these sharp, jagged edges from when I decided to make a drum set out of a piano. And I officially started taking lessons at 11, and church was a great way to just get into playing music with other people, which has been kind of the thing I've always aimed for. I don't really want to be a drummer that just is in my drum room playing by myself. I always want to have that connection with other musicians. So it gave me experience early on, and that led me towards studying music at university, and from there I discovered jazz, and it was just kind of off to the races for me.
Okay, so specifically, you kind of focus on jazz, or do you focus on more than that? Are you into rock or?
Church kind of in that world, it is kind of rock and roll, and so I started with rock. I loved Rush. I just Neil Peart was my guy. I played along to every Rush record I could. And that was really where I fell in love with drums first, was in that genre of music, and specifically with that band. I love Chicago. I love the Eagles, and
Mhm.
yeah, Skinner, all that kind of stuff. I was into that, and I discovered a Buddy Rich big band album, and that was the first time I'd ever heard jazz drumming, and it was just on a whole separate level, and it was
Mhm.
like I got to figure out how to do that, which kind of led me into jazz. So I still have kept that love for all styles of music. I think I really did study jazz more than anything else, but I think I would rather be more of a holistic musician and take in all styles and really learn from anything and everything that I can.
Yeah, well, with that, who were your first or initial influences on drumming that inspired
So
you to want to play?
yeah. Neil Peart was a big one. I loved Dave Matthews Band. So Carter Beauford was a big one.
Yeah.
And when I went into jazz was really when I started studying like the lineage of music, the lineage of drumming, and from there I discovered Elvin and Tony and Philly Joe, and it was like that was kind of my world for a pretty long time. Uh and then obviously you get into the modern guys, and currently I would say guys like Brian Blade and Dave King,
Mm,
uh, Mark Juliana, guys like that really have inspired me. And when you study them, you can't help but go back and see, like, go back and study what they studied, and you start to see this connecting line with all of drummers, all of music. There's always a thread, and you can't study Bill Stewart without studying Roy Haynes. You know what I mean? And it just kind
mhm.
of goes back, and that's where you can really like take in influences from everywhere. So I have very specific drummers that I love, but I really try not to harp too much on one guy or like a handful of guys. I want to keep it open so that I don't get locked into trying just to mimic or copy another player.
Well, you spoke about Philly Joe Jones specifically. What do you see about him why he was such a great contribution to drumming?
Uh, I would say his finesse. I kind of put him and Max Roach in a similar category of just their the way how refined their drumming is, and how technical it feels, but it's effortless. Like the mastery just feels like
Mhm.
effortless, and it flows out of them. And um, I feel like it's the most classy, refined kind of drumming. That's kind of what I love about Philly Joe. And then if you get into something like a drummer like Elvin, you
Mhm.
can't help but just talk about like the earthy, raw, organic power that he has. And it kind of sits in a different category for me. And then you go to Tony, and it's just like the power and the precision, and I love how like every player you can kind of boil them down, to you can take a couple descriptor words, and that's like what you like about that drummer. And then
Right.
from there you can kind of piece together the kind of drummer you want to be and sort of take influences, and you become kind of an amalgam of all the people that you love, which that's my favorite part of this whole art form. You know what I mean?
Hmm. Well, that's exactly it. You talk about like some of these older jazz players, and when I was younger, I used to get Modern Drummer, loved Modern Drummer, but the
Mhm.
problem is I had no reference point for these jazz players. So your introduction to those jazz players was specifically primarily through school. Is that correct?
Yeah, definitely at
Okay.
university. I had some really great professors. A guy named Rick Dilling, who's based out of Asheville, North Carolina. I went to school at Appalachian State University in Boone, North Carolina, and so he was the drum set professor there. Also,
Hmm.
a guy named Byron Hedgepeth. These guys were they really introduced me to a lot of these players, and then you can get introduced to one drummer and then start there, and then go on a YouTube rabbit trail and find a bunch of other people. So
Yeah.
that's kind of what I ended up doing in college.
That's fantastic. No, I that's the only part I didn't care for about Modern Drummer is that in retrospect now what I do is I pull out those magazines now and then I look up the drummer to see what they were doing so I can have an understanding of what their contribution was. So
Yeah.
when you mentioned those players, I was just kind of excited because I know you're a little bit of a younger guy and
Mhm.
compared to me. And you have that respect of the founders of jazz, so that modern jazz. So that's
Yeah.
fantastic. So you mentioned a couple of modern, continued inspirations, Dave King specifically. Can you mention a couple of words about Dave King that you maybe stand out to you, that why you think he's such a standout player today?
So I got to meet Dave. He came to my shop a couple months back, and we got to geek out about cymbals. I got to show him some of the stuff that I did, and that was like a pretty huge moment for me because I've been studying his music for over a decade, and just I love how playful he is and how he's got such he's got great technique. He's got an effortlessness to his playing. He's got a classy refinedness to his playing. You know, he can do all that stuff, but it's like his playing is kind of quirky. It's like it almost it invites you into it. It kind of makes me feel like I can do something like that. You know what I mean? Like I listen to Tony Williams and I'm like, I will never play like that. There's nothing, right. There's no amount of like practice or whatever. I'm never going to be like that. I listen to Dave King and I feel like invited into the music, and I kind of feel inspired to develop my own voice, because his voice is so distinct,
right,
and unique. Yeah. And that's probably what I love most about his playing. I would say similar things about Brian Blade too. It's just
okay.
You feel invited into this sense of I can be a part of this lineage of music. Like I don't have to have all the chops and all the technique in the world. I can develop my ear and develop a sense of musicality, and I can play simply, and it can be really inspiring to listen to. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's
it completely does. Because what's interesting about Dave King is he's a local guy in Minnesota here. I'm from Minnesota, and cool. One of my partners in this, he used to be a roommate of his, and cool. He's also a phenomenal player. And when I see Dave King play now, it's significantly different than what I've heard about him. He's just this drummer who can just blow the drum set apart. You know what I mean?
Yes.
And in his more recent professional performances, I haven't seen that yet. And I wish I could experience that, because he's got such an explosive ability of power, creativity. And when people watch him, he just can't, you can't take your eyes off of him. So
yeah, you don't know what he's going to do next. Like he's like a total lack of cliche. It's like Jack DeJohnette. Like that's, I think of Jack DeJohnette and I think of like that guy has no licks. Somehow he's like lickless. I don't know. Like Bill Stewart is like all licks. You know what I mean? You hear him play a tom roll, and I've heard him play that same exact tom roll in 5 different songs and 5 different records. But you listen to Jack D, and it's like he's constantly creating something fresh and new that I've never heard him do. I kind of think of Dave King the same way. So we might hear a baby screaming in the background. We just had a kid, my wife and I. So
yeah, congratulations! I'm sorry, I forgot to say that. That's so awesome. So is this your first kid?
First kid, yeah. We're kind of in that, figuring it out. She's like 2 weeks old, barely 2 weeks old. Just like, what is it like to have 2 hours of sleep? How are we going to survive?
It doesn't change.
yeah, that's what I hear. It's like, yeah, get used to it. You're going to stay here for a while. So
yeah, well, the blessing of them, the blessing is so worth it. So
oh yeah, totally, it's amazing.
Yeah. And you can warp their future with playing drums too. So
yes,
I got to get one of my kids hooked into the whole idea of drumming. So we'll see if I can work on the other 2.
Yep. There you go.
So talking about this, to make the leap from being interested in playing and being a fan of drumming to creating the instrument, you manufacture drums, and you're creating custom on-demand cymbals. So first, can we talk about the drum set? What drew you into wanting to craft drum sets?
Yeah, so I played out of university, really short little history. Out of university, I played professionally, semi-professionally for about 5 years. I was fortunate enough to do a little bit of touring, got to see the country, got to see the world, even got to go travel overseas and do some fun stuff. And it was cool and all, but I've always wanted to be a family guy. I always wanted to be married and to have kids and kind of have a quiet, settled life. And traveling was cool and exciting at first, but then I started to realize, wow, doing this year after year would kind of wear on me. And it's kind of a young man's game. I am still young, obviously, but like it's a young man's game. And I kind of wanted to build something that could keep me at home and keep me around my family. And that's just like probably the most important thing in my life. Way more important than drums or cymbals is just family. So, so that was on one side of me. I was kind of having that experience, but then on another side, I hit into some of the difficulties of, you start to deal with interpersonal relationships. And so I took the drum chair from this guy who was the best friend of the band leader. They had a falling out, so he left, and then I got the drum chair. it was given like a verbal, confirmation that I had all the gigs next year. And so I made plans to move across the country. It was going to be like my full-time touring gig. I was going to do some booking and admin on the side so it was going to be a full-time job to play drums with this group. And then just out of nowhere, I got the call that he decided he wanted to go back to his old drummer because they had patched things up. And so I was a young guy, and I had been out of the scene in Charlotte, North Carolina for about 6 to 8 months. So people forget about you pretty quick, when you're unavailable. So I had to move back in with my parents. I was super dejected and a little hopeless, and like, what do I do with my life now? And I had always wanted to just make a snare drum. It was something that I thought would be kind of interesting to be able to like hold something that I put together. I don't really have any background in metallurgy or woodworking or anything like that. I grew up just playing outside in the woods and playing music. That was like all I really ever did. So I had to have like a crash course in just general woodworking stuff. And I scoured YouTube. I signed up to some online resources to learn how to like DIY drum build. And I did that for a little while. And when I made my first snare drum, it was like almost an instant connection. Like, this is what I want to do. Like something with music being so intangible, you can practice hours and hours, and then you just play a song or you play a gig. You don't really have anything to hold at the end of it. You leave going, did I play well, or did they like me, or did they not? And it feels kind of abstract whereas like making a snare drum, it's like I make it and then I hold it. I'm like, wow, I did this. This is kind of cool. So that connection, I really connected with that experience of being able to hold something that I crafted. And I've always been more obsessed with cymbals than drums. I was always kind of intimidated by tuning drums and never felt like I really had a good handle on even how to do it. But I just didn't know it was possible to work on cymbals. I didn't know it was possible to make cymbals. It felt like such a mystical craft and an unattainable thing to do. So I didn't really like explore that option. I was like, well, I can make drums. I'll start there. And then things kind of grew from there, and I started making percussion accessories. I had a cracked cymbal that it was like the first cymbal I ever got, and I cracked it. I was super sad about it. And I just had a metal grinder lying around for some reason. I was like, what if I just cut this thing up and like made little jingly things? And then I was like, okay, how would I hang it? I could hang it on a crash cymbal and it'd make like a trashy effects thing. And so I figured I could just punch holes, put a little dog tag through it, and I could hang it on different parts of the kit.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden from there, it was like, okay, how do I get cracked cymbals? So I started messaging all my buddies, like, do you have any cracked cymbals? I'll pay shipping if you can just give them to me. And then that was what launched Stack Ring Percussion, which is percussion accessories, percussion products made of recycled cymbal material and steel and all kinds of cool metals. And then that was another gateway into the cymbal world, because I would get crash cymbals that had little small cracks and just take my grinder and just like scoop out the crack, and then all of a sudden it was a playable cymbal. And then from there it's like, well, what if I hammer it? And then I started messing with that. Then it was like, oh man, what if I had a lathe one day? Eventually I ended up building a lathe, and then it was super dangerous. And cymbal smithing is like an incredibly dangerous thing. It's amazing. I still have both my arms and all my fingers and toes. But anyway, so from there, it was kind of a snowball effect. And I just kept going, what if I could do this? What if I could do that? And then eventually I would try it and fail my way into what I'm doing now, which is cymbal smithing. So
you're definitely standing out in the field of what you're doing, which is pretty remarkable.
Oh,
and unlike some other people, what you're doing, you're actually asking people come to you and you build per their specific request. Can you talk a little bit about, first of all, you mentioned earlier that you get blanks from Turkey. Is that the case for you?
Yeah.
So can you explain that process and what's the advantage of that versus trying to smelt it and pound it out yourself?
Yeah. So as of right now, there are some things changing, but as of right now, the only foundry in the US is Zildjian, and Zildjian is not going to talk to me. If I go to them and say, hey, can I buy this? They're not going to talk to me, which is fine. I understand it. There are some of the old guard independent cymbal smiths were able to get blanks from Sabian. I believe Matt Bettis was able to source his blanks from Sabian a little bit, but
Okay.
as it stands now in Turkey, that's where all of the foundries are. That's where a lot of cymbals are produced. There's a lot of companies that will just approach a foundry in Istanbul, and they'll get them to make cymbals, and then they ship them over and they stamp a logo on them, whatever logo, kind of OEM stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But Turkey is where there's this really rich lineage of cymbal making that goes back hundreds of years. So for me, I was introduced to Dave Collingwood, who is another amazing independent cymbalsmith. He's going to be at the panel. He's a really good buddy of mine. He trained me and did a lot of like, he actually really helped me kind of clear away a lot of the stuff that can be kind of pitfalls when you're learning this craft. And so he gave me a couple references of some foundries to reach out to. And it was as simple as just sending an email and saying, hey, I like to buy blanks. And for those Turkish guys, I mean, they, if they can just, stamp a blank out or whatever and sell it, and they don't, do anything else with it, they're happy to do that. So it's fairly easy to source blanks. Shipping is obviously kind of crazy, but that was a fairly easy thing, easier than I thought it would be, just to kind of send an email and then all of a sudden, okay, I got blanks at my front door. I can start hammering.
Mm-hmm. Well, before we get to the next phase, the other interesting thing right now is that I'm getting ready to go to NAMM, and most of the large companies have pulled out of NAMM. And one of the biggest issues is the cost of doing business nowadays, and specifically the fluctuation in metal costs. In some cases, it's 7 times what it used to be. How is the fluctuation in cost, and specifically precious metal taxes and import costs, impacting you compared to a year ago?
It's I would say for me, I've seen probably about like a 30% price increase.
Oh, okay.
So it hasn't been as bad as it has been for some companies, because I've heard of like 150% increases in prices. I have had really crazy increases in drum hardware costs. That's been a huge thing. And I think with COVID and kind of what happened in our world with COVID was really, really detrimental to the big companies, because they have just such large overhead. And the benefit of a company like mine, or a bunch of the other boutique makers out there, is we can be a little bit more flexible because our overhead is lower. So especially with my company, because I have different brands, I've always been able to kind of fluctuate in between the brands depending on what was happening in the market. So there have been times where drum sales were really dry, and either I'll push marketing into the drums to try to get them back up, or I'll just focus on the cymbals or focus on the percussion accessories, and things can kind of fluctuate in that way. And that's really hedged me against the risk involved with just a lot of the crazy upheaval in the market today. So I'm really fortunate. I didn't intend to do that. It kind of just, I sort of like fell into that mode, and it's worked out really well for us. So.
Well, that's fantastic. And again, that's one of the strengths of what you're doing. But I was going to just quickly, not to drone on about the cost, but I want people to understand that it's like everything's different now than even when it was a year ago. I just met up. Have you ever heard of GPI rims mounts?
Yeah.
Okay, so Gary Gogger, who invented rims, is a friend of mine, and we just got together. And he, about a year ago, he stopped selling or producing new rims mounts, specifically because aluminum costs went up 7 times in 1 year. I mean, it's insane. And so I also I used to custom build drums. Now I'm focusing back on hardware again. And what the difficulty is just, the cost of just raw materials, especially when I make something American made. It's hard to find a foundry in America anymore that offers every type of metal. It's a very weird time right now. So I don't want to go on further about that, but just specifically, that's an interesting impact on profits nowadays and availability. And fluctuation in costs. So you get what was the process of, developing your technique in cymbal craftsmanship?
Tons of failure, tons of just like screwing things up and going, man, I wish I hadn't done that. I just ruined that. I just, you just kind of like, you just take $100 bills and you just chuck them in the toilet, and then you just You just flush it. That's, but in all seriousness, it is a lot of failure, but it's like every time you do something that doesn't work, you calculate, you take, okay, well, what if I had done this differently? And then you try it again and you make adjustments. And it really has, for me, been mostly surrounding doing modifications. So I didn't really touch on that, but I started with modifying cymbals before I ever made an original. And I probably modified close to 500 cymbals before I ever hammered a blank. So I had seen every type of cymbal, every brand, every type of cymbal had come through my shop. So I was like constantly taking a look at the profile, taking a look at the bell, seeing what kind of hammering was done, and then taking my, limited skills at the time and just, pounding on it and trying to see if I could adjust or morph the sound in some way. So that was really a great entryway into the world of cymbal smithing for me, was just modifying cymbals. And it's amazing just how little how little work you can do to drastically change the sound of an existing cymbal. And so it was a crash course for me. And I still do modifications all the time. I have probably 20 to 40 mods come through my shop every month. And I've got an apprentice that helps me with that kind of stuff. And that's another kind of little side hustle that you can have to sort of help you in this crazy world of this crazy industry, just to make sure you can feed yourself and, keep a roof over your head. But yeah, so that's been the way for me, has been a lot of failure, a lot of, I wish I hadn't done that. And then a lot of learning and I think a healthy dose of obsession with cymbals has really helped me too. So.
No, that's fantastic. So I guess where I'm kind of going with this is like, who's your customer specifically? What kind of person is your customer? What are they looking for?
Yeah, I would say that my customer is mostly jazz guys, or guys that just have I don't really deal with too many rock and roll dudes. Like and this is by no means a slight against rock and roll dudes. I just find that like there are guys that they sit down at the drums and they just want to express themselves, and they don't really think too much about like what they're hitting, and it's all meant to be loud and just in your face and powerful. And I love that kind of drumming. But I've found that my customer is like really attuned to the sound of their cymbals, and they're like, I had a guy in the shop the other day, and we were in my shop for about 3 hours just tweaking this one cymbal that he had. And it was like, what about this? I'm hearing this one frequency that's a major third above this one, and it's kind of competing with this dissonant tone over here. And like, how can we adjust that? So, and that's another way that I feel like I've been able to develop, is just by having really amazing customers that really know their stuff. So it's a lot of like guys that are really in tune with the sound of their instruments, and they're really looking for something that can help them express their voice.
Until we were talking tonight or today, I mean, you mentioned you have like 30 to 40 customers or mods a month on cymbals. And for a handcrafted or modified cymbal, it's amazing to me that there's that much of a customer base. So I'm wondering what has changed in the music and, the drumming community where they want to express themselves differently. Have you talked to drummers about that?
Yeah, I have. And I've talked to a lot of my other independent cymbal smithing buddies about this as well. And I think it kind of gets into the history of cymbal making and kind of, what has happened in the last 60 plus years to lead us where we are. And I'll see if I can like really condense this and just do like a super bare bones. I'm not saying everything that happened, but essentially you've got, the old stamp and intermediate stamp and new stamp, old Ks. You've got older As. You've got these two Zildjian entities fighting each other. And then in the 70s, you have this massive change in music where things get very electrified and loud. And so manufacturers start making instruments to accompany the fact that like that music is just so much louder now. We have all these electric guitars and like electric basses and stacks and 80s hair metal bands that are just like, they blow your face off. They're so loud. So the cymbals just got super thick. The bells got really big and bright and cutting. And all along there's been this group of jazz musicians that still play in cafes, that still play in quieter settings. They're still playing with no monitors. They're just listening to an acoustic bass. Like, how are you supposed to hear an acoustic bass over top of a drum set? It requires such immense technique, and it requires certain kinds of instruments. So that's where you have this, there's always been this desire for these older K Zildjian cymbals, which there is a fervor surrounding those cymbals now, and how valuable they are, and all of that. But really, those guys were doing, the old K Zildjians were made in the same way that these independent cymbalsmiths are making cymbals now. So it's an artisan sitting down and hammering a cymbal into shape and lathing it, and you get a much more human element. Oftentimes those cymbals are a little bit quieter in nature. They're lower pitched, they're darker, they're more smoky and complex, all the things that jazz guys and Americana, folk, all kinds of music, that there are rock and roll guys that love dark, smoky, complex sounding cymbals, So we've had this kind of pendulum swing backwards towards these older vintage sounds. And I would say that's been the last 20 years, we've been seeing that happen, this pendulum swing back. So you've got all these Turkish companies like Agop, you've got Meinl and Paiste and Bosphorus, and all these companies that make really dark, thin cymbals because there's such a demand for these more expressive instruments, instruments that aren't just one dimensional, and they're not just, loud. However you hit it, it's going to be loud. Right. They want cymbals that you can play really softly, but then you can really dig in and it'll go with you there. And it can be really as expressive as you can be as a drummer. So I find that's where people are nowadays. And so you kind of have a lot of the big companies scrambling to try to meet the demand of that. And different companies are doing it with different degrees of success, I would say. But oftentimes I modify a lot of cymbals from major brands that are the top of the line cymbals that they make. And it's, you spend $700 on a ride, you think it's going to sound good, it's going to be well balanced, and that isn't always the case. So there's a lot in there. I hope that answers the question.
No, it does. It's fantastic, and it's fascinating. It kind of makes me think about boutique drum manufacturing. So years ago, before that became more of a thing, I was building drums way back in the 80s, and I learned from a craftsman about the quality of actual drum making, not actually constructing the shell, but like, even if you bought a Keller shell, what's weird is that you hear about different people saying that Keller shell's bad or good, but what it really comes down to is a craftsman of what do they do with that shell to make it good. And then the second complaint is, if they don't totally match the shells, like, so what I used to do is I was going to be an actual distributor for Keller before they sold everyone, and I was going to do specifically external finishes or plies of wood that were more exotic, because they didn't want to house all that and do all that kind of stuff, and I had kind of a pulse on all that. But in order to really match a set, you got to have the same tonal tone to each shell, and then you have to match the finish. And it really came down to a level of craftsmanship and not just the functional manufacturing of the object itself. And like you're talking about fine tuning a cymbal, it's not unlike fine tuning a drum set.
Not at all. I was gonna say that's a great point. It's like that. You see that video of John Good, tone matching, the guy from DW, like tone matching the shells. He used to do that at DW. That's a huge point. I think that bigger companies really, in a lot of ways, it's not a slight against them. They just don't have the capacity to have that level of quality there if they're going to meet their price point. So that's that if you're going to pay $500 for a drum set, you're the quality level, it's not going to be crafted well. It's going to be crafted to just get it out the door. You know what I mean? Like, so that's a really good point.
Well, yeah, and it was so funny you talk about John Good and how they totally do that. The quality drum manufacturer, and primarily the drum manufacturers that I'm talking about are people who actually own drum shops, and they had to do the repairs for the drummers when they're on tour because there are no drum techs. And they kind of developed a process of matching and tonality. That's kind of where we have the understanding of today of crafting drum shells, and or actually refining drum shells. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is that idea of pounding on a shell to get the note has been around since the 50s. And if you look at old pictures of drummers in the studio, a lot of times you'll see they'll have a note on the drum head or in the shell. And maybe every drum looks different, but specifically the set was balanced in the studio. And that's the number one issue I have with craftsmen today is that, they buy the shells, but they don't match the tones. And so I get called in so often to recording studios and drum shops, and the set it's not consistent. Well, it's because tonally they don't match. Yeah. And taking that same concept, let's say somebody came to you and wanted to have a set of cymbals, or if they want to match a cymbal specifically to their set, is it something you kind of have to listen to what they want, or do you kind of go by what the person comes to you and says they want?
Yeah, it's both. So it with cymbals, with drums, it's a little bit more straightforward. I find like when someone's going for a particular sound, because there are the factors of the heads and how they tune and how they play on the back end is such a huge part of that process. So that I know if I get I've got a certain like quality level that I hit with my drums. And I kind of know from there, I have to let it go. And there's going to be so much that's going to vary on how experienced the drummer is with tuning their own drums or playing their own drums. And that's really going to affect. And I try to educate and have as much teaching materials as possible for customers on that end. So that if they're like, I can't really get this snare to sound the way I want, I'll go in and I'll say, well, how's your bottom snare head tensioned? How are your snare wires tensioned? Are they too tight and your bottom head's too loose? Is that what's going on? Maybe you need to balance this more. But all that to be said, with cymbals, it's like a whole nother level of subjectivity that almost baffles the mind, I find. And I think drummers all have different ideas of what they mean when they say certain buzzwords.
Yes.
So
well, with the drum set, I'm not trying to jump on you here, but the thing is, the reason why I'm excited you're kind of going down this road is that I always feel a cymbal is more of a representation of your sound than a drum set is, because I can hear one drummer play 50 different drum sets and it sounds like the same drummer, but that cymbal they specifically use is the difference, and is finding that tonality. So I'm sorry, not jumping there, but it's just such an interesting process that you could actually take a top level cymbal and further refine it. That's just a really cool process. So can you talk a little bit about that? Like, there's lathing a cymbal, there's hand hammering a cymbal. I can only imagine having a 20 to 22 inch objects hurling into, rotating at a high velocity, what that's got to be like.
Yeah.
Explain a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's so kind of along the same lines. Like when you get to cymbals, you're dealing with such a wide range of what people mean when they say words, but then you're also dealing with the thing that is the most personal to them. So like you said, it is the thing that kind of defines people's sound, is like their cymbals. Like I when I think of Bill Stewart, I can't think of Bill Stewart and not think of like the cymbal sounds he gets, Right. I do think of his drum sounds, and I think those are just as relevant and important. But my mind goes to like that cymbal sound, and how does he get that level of click out of his ride cymbal patterns? Like, how does it sound that woody and smoky and complex? So when people come to me and they're asking about either having a cymbal modified or having me commission one, they give me references. They tell me, I ask them for the kind of stick that they use. I would love to see them play. So I'm like, if you have a video of yourself playing, I would love to watch that. So with that, there's a whole nother level of things that I have to try and think about, because I'm trying to almost put myself in their shoes and pretend like I'm them. And I try to think like they do. So I take like the emails that we go back and forth, and I try to decipher, when they say dark, what are they actually meaning? Like their dark might be bright to me. So that's where I can take a look at the type of playing that they have, the sticks that they use, any references that they send. And then the other level, and this might be going too deep, but this is kind of where my mind goes, is when they send me a recording and they say, I really love this cymbal sound, I then have to go in and kind of try and interpret, what does that cymbal sound like in the room? Because recording is just going to change how that cymbal translates in such an unbelievable way. the great example is the Nefertiti ride, Tony Williams. Like that cymbal is such a sought after sound. And that cymbal probably would not sound good to the majority of people that love that cymbal sound on the record, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So if they were to actually sit behind that cymbal was actually pretty daggum heavy. And so most jazz drummers that like the Nefertiti ride, if they sat behind it and played it, they'd be like, ooh, this is too pingy. This is too bright. This is too shrill. This is too loud. But then you'd be like, well, actually that's the Nefertiti ride. That's the one that you love, but it's through Tony's impeccable playing. It's through, the recording technology that existed in that time frame, and then how it translates through our modern devices, and there's all these levels of there's all these filters that this stuff kind of has to go through to get to our ears. And then we make the judgment about what we're hearing and if it is a good sound or a bad sound. And so, for me, I kind of see that like commissions and when people come to me with requests, it's a really dangerous thing to undertake because there are so many subjective qualities to sound. And so with that, I kind of enjoy the danger, I enjoy the kind of like
the discovery you like.
Yes. Yeah. I enjoy the cure. I have a curious mind about like, how is this going to turn out? Like, I don't even really know. Like this person wants me to make an Elvin Jones ride. Let's see how it turns out kind of thing.
Wow.
So that could be very anxiety inducing, mm-hmm. but I kind of choose to just have fun with it. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I got to say it's just got to be such a tricky thing. Because the one thing that was interesting to me is that depending on the cymbal company and depending on the era, even with the same model, the cymbal 16-inch crash can sound completely different on how they balance the metals going into it. So it is so subjective to what people want and hear. And it's just, I don't know, it's amazing. This is such a whole new world to me. I heard about people custom building gongs, and I've heard about people doing that. And where they actually just take a big hunk of brass and they start hammering it and welding it together. And the cymbal, what the instrument is with the cymbal is just such a different thing than any other element. I guess I want to just talk quickly about the camaraderie between other cymbal manufacturers, because there isn't necessarily a whole lot of camaraderie in the drum building world. It seems like there's a lot of competition, and but with the cymbals, it sounds like a whole interesting family. Can you talk a little bit about that, the community?
Yeah. So I mentioned Dave Collingwood. Dave is a buddy of mine. He has a Patreon where he teaches people how to make cymbals. So you can come to him with zero know-how or knowledge, and you can sign up for his Patreon, and he'll walk you through step one and get you to that place of being able to actually craft your own cymbals. There's just a group of independent makers that we all have just become friends from meeting at trade shows, and we share information. I was on the phone with a cymbalsmith buddy of mine yesterday, talking to him about his lathe, and I wanted to know more about it. I want to know how he designed it, and he's just like, absolutely, let me go back to my shop. He was like walking down the street, leaving his shop. He turned cool. Right back around. We FaceTimed. He was showing me all the stuff that he did. Mm-hmm. Paul Francis has become a friend of mine, and he just texts me and he's like, hey, how's your kid doing? And I've called him and asked him like, hey, you met, you had the Nefertiti ride. Like, tell me about that ride. What was it like in person? And he's just totally free to share. I think what we're realizing, and this is kind of the cool aspect of the indie cymbalsmith world right now, mm-hmm. is we're all kind of realizing, and we've been sort of unintentionally creating this atmosphere where there isn't a lot of cutthroat competition between the makers, and we kind of are trusting in the fact that there's enough for all of us. You know what I mean? There's the cymbal market in the world is like, I don't know, $50 million industry or something like that. That number might be wrong, but I heard something around that, like a $50 million industry. Mm-hmm. And the big guys obviously have the biggest chunks of those. but the hundreds of thousands of cymbals that are sold every single year, there's so many drummers out there buying, selling, searching for cymbal sounds. And there's really relatively such a small amount of us indie makers out there. And the people discovering us are starting to see, like Paul Francis at Cymbal Craftsman. He's got his own sound. Nicky Moon at NickyMoon Custom Cymbals. He's got his own sound. And so then artists are starting to connect with the makers, and they're starting to see, like, instead of this kind of brand loyalty thing, like I kind of hate brand loyalty. I want to just be able to play anything and everything. So I kind of want to foster that sort of mentality in people and say, okay, I don't want you necessarily to be exclusively Timothy Roberts. Your cymbals are all my cymbals. Mm-hmm. I would love for you to realize that, like, me as a maker, I have a certain sound. If you connect with that sound, great. I will sell you a cymbal all day. I'm not trying to push you away or send you somewhere else. I will sell you a cymbal. But maybe you want Mongiello's sound. Like, he's got a sound that's different from mine. Maybe you want Matt Bettis' sound or Craig Loritz's sound. And maybe you also want to mix and match and say, like, I want a Craig Loritzson and I want a Dave Collingwood and I want a Timothy Roberts cymbal. And that's going to make up my set. And it becomes so much more interesting that way. It's like we can actually foster inspiration on the drums by not being so, like, close-fisted about my cymbals are the best, or like, don't go to him, his cymbals suck, my cymbals are great. I kind of hate that stuff, and I've experienced a lot of that stuff in the music world, and kind of the performance side of it is just so cutthroat. People are mean. They're straight up mean. They are straight up backstabbing, and it's like, man, I got into music because I loved music. I didn't get into music to try and cut down other people. Like, and I think that there's enough people out there like that we're starting to kind of gather in this community of people, and people are discovering that exists. And it's like a rising tide lifts all boats kind of situation.
Oh, totally. That's a great way of putting it.
Yeah.
I mean, like you said, things are changing now in the community. I think people are kind of getting fed up with, like you said earlier, purchasing a cymbal for $700 or more, and you get them home and they just don't sound good and you can't return them. You're kind of stuck with them. So it's great that companies like you, I mean, not companies, but individuals like you, craftsmen like you, can actually help people refine that investment into something new. That's a total new idea I've never even thought about. I think that's so really, really neat that you're doing that.
Thanks. Yeah.
So if people want to do that, what's the best way to get a hold of you if they want to refine their cymbal?
Yeah, so I've tried to make it as simple as humanly possible. So if you go to reveriedrums.com, I have a shop page, and then there's a little category called cymbal mods, and you just click on that, and it's got 3 different types of mods. I do a lot of repairs. So if guys have like a beloved cymbal and it's got a little crack in it, I'll do repairs. I'll do typical modifications, which are usually hammering and or lathing to dial in a certain sound. And then there's also patina modifications, and I've kind of developed this really funky, crazy patina mod where you can just add a ton of gunk to a cymbal to make it really dry and earthy sounding. And so you can go there and just a couple buttons and you've ordered a modification, and then we exchange an email, and the website charges for shipping. So all you do is just box the thing up and then send us the weight and the dimensions, and I email a shipping label. So that I try to make that as easy as possible. And then on that same shop page, you can see the drums that we make, the percussion accessories that we make. And then there's also a page for my batch drops. I'll drop like 10 to 15 cymbals every couple weeks or so. And then you can also order a cymbal commission, which is just a totally custom cymbal. And again, I'm emailing constantly all day. I'm emailing people. So it's very much like if you're going to order something from our company, then you're going to be talking to me and or my wife, and and we go from there.
That's fantastic. So what would it cost to have a cymbal modified? Is there like a per hour charge? Is there a base fee? Or I noticed that with one of them, you mentioned that you can have like one modification to it that's included in whatever the price is. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So the main designator is the cymbal modification product, and you go into that and you can do any and everything to your cymbal. So there are people that want like 1,000 grams removed. They want it heavily hammered. They want a heavy patina. They want a crack repair, and it's kind of all in that. The pricing breakdown for repairs is like $50 before shipping. For a modification that includes a little bit of lathing and hammering, that starts at $85, and then it can go upwards of 150, kind of around $150. So I try to make it as affordable as possible. If I were to do an hourly rate, it would be more expensive.
Right.
And what's great about the modification thing is it's a great way for me to keep refining my craft and keep new cymbals coming in, and I'm able to like really keep a gauge on what's out there, and oftentimes I'm not getting the good cymbals, obviously, because they're sending them to me to have them changed. So that's really informed a lot of my original cymbals, and it's great because I've got it's an amazing teaching tool for me to show an apprentice, hey, this is how I'm going to modify the cymbal. Watch me do it. And then I can kind of get them into the world. And, the goal is eventually to have a couple guys that apprentice under me, and we make the cymbals together, because you start hitting that cap of what you can do by yourself, which we're getting pretty close to that now.
I mean, $50 for a cymbal repair is incredibly reasonable. I'm sorry, that's really a really good price.
Which with that, I mean, it becomes a volume game. Like, so if we were to get into kind of industry stuff, like there's the boutique side and the volume side, and boutique products are just more expensive because it is so much more labor and
right.
labor. There's so much more labor. There's so much more time. There's so much more expertise going into it. And so with my company, I've tried to sort of land in the middle so that I can be really responsive. I can make stuff that's affordable to working musicians, but then it's also still got the artisan craftsman thing with it. I just find that I don't like to land in one camp or the other. You know what I mean? I try to do what I can to be as good as I can be sort of in the middle of that. And I would rather working drummers play my stuff anyway. Right. I want anyone and everyone to be able to have access to it, obviously. And I've got some people that are, doctors and lawyers that buy my stuff, and it's in their little drum room, and that's great. I love that. I also love it when there's working drummers that, play gigs that only pay $50, and they can afford a cymbal of mine. You know what I mean?
Right. That's fantastic. So we weren't able to hit the 30 minutes.
Yeah, too much fun. We're having too much fun.
The thing is, I'm getting to the point where I could continually go. So I'm trying to try to modify my my questions here. So let's talk a little bit about the panel. What can people expect when they see you? Will it be meet and greet afterwards? Can they talk to you?
Yeah. So on Saturday at the Chicago Drum Show, there is going to be a block of time where it's going to be presentations. So I believe it's 8 cymbalsmiths, and we all have like a 30-minute block, and you can see the schedule. And Eric Binder is going to be the guy that I think facilitates it, or is he might be the MC or something. But he's kind of coming in talking about, because he's very knowledgeable as a drummer, very knowledgeable about cymbals. So he'll kind of introduce people. Everyone's going to have a different shtick. I don't really know what I'm going to say, but I'll just probably go up there and talk a little bit about what I do, and then they'll maybe answer some questions or whatnot. And generally speaking, I'm just going to speak about the projects that I'm working on now. The cymbal, I've got all kinds of different cymbal series. We didn't talk necessarily about what I would consider my voice, the kind of things, the sounds I'm after. So all of that will be at the panel. That's kind of what I'm going to dive into. And then Sunday, the day after, is going to be a round table with all of us.
Okay.
And so maybe that is actually where Eric is going to be facilitating the conversation. And so that'll be kind of a discussion. We all know each other. We're all buddies. We've all interacted online before. So it'll be a really fun time. I'm going to also have a booth at the Chicago show, so you'll be able to check out the cymbals and drums and accessories that we make. And I'm really excited. The Chicago show is something I've been wanting to go to or exhibit at for years now. So this should be really fun.
But hey, Timothy, thank you so much. This was so amazing to get to know you. I'm excited to see your presentations at the Chicago Drum Show. This will be a really fun experience. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. I appreciate it.
This has been a production of the Drumming News Network. All rights reserved. All media is owned by the respective parties. This episode cannot be distributed or copied in any form. Please visit DrummingNewsNetwork.com daily to keep up on all the latest drumming news. Copyright 2023.